Welcome to the Troutman Sanders Battery and Storage Podcast. I'm your co-host, Cliff Sikora.
And I'm Bill Durasmo.
In this podcast,
we will interview battery and storage experts, industry thought leaders, Cliff.
We want you to hear the unique perspectives that we hear from industry veterans and how they're deploying this new and very exciting technology into an industry that wasn't particularly exciting for most folks just several years ago.
But you know, the focus of this podcast is going to be on the people, the thought leadership. We're not necessarily going to get into the weeds on technical issues, but we're going to focus on the transformation of the resource fleet and how storage fits within that transformation. We're going to get into some of the cutting-edge regulatory and policy issues. We're going to talk a little bit about how you finance and deploy these assets, how you seek cost recovery. Are you going to look at on-balance sheet or off-balance sheet? We're going to talk about some of the planning issues associated with these devices.
And in addition, there are numerous issues associated with operating storage resources once they are deployed. What sort of products can they provide? How will those products be priced? Will they be priced in front of the meter? Will they be priced in back of the meter? Will the two dovetail with one another? What is the future of solar plus storage, microgrids, and environmental issues? On the surface, one might say that batteries are an environmental benefit, but not necessarily. Accordingly, we look forward to bringing you thought leaders, folks who have been in the industry for many years and are dealing with an assumption change, a major transformational change regarding the physics of the business. Electricity can now be stored.
This is an exciting time. We hope you join us.
Hello, this is Cliff Sikora, and I'm here with my partner, Bill Durasmo. And this is the Troutman Battery and Storage Podcast. And today we are very, very lucky to have with us Commissioner Phil Moeller, who is currently Executive Vice President with the Edison Electric Institute. He is Executive Vice President for Business Operations with that group and Regulatory Affairs. And his portfolio covers, I guess the question is, what doesn't it cover? The list is lengthy. He is in charge of EEI's energy supply and finance issues, environmental issues, energy delivery, energy services, federal and state regulatory issues, and international affairs. So I think it's just everything having to do with electricity globally, Commissioner, wouldn't you say?
It's a wide-ranging portfolio. It does not include things such as our communications team and our Hill folks, but again, a lot of the business operations and the regulatory side of our industry, which are increasingly important.
Right. And it's so, and there, as we'll talk about today, the issues are novel. I think even from when we were first starting in the business a few years back, I would say. It's a little bit more than a few years, though, right?
It's more than a few years, but the speed of transformation is really remarkable, and I really appreciate you inviting me in to give some perspectives and have a conversation today.
Thanks so much. One of the reasons I think we wanted to talk to you, in addition to your position with the EEI and the issues that are sort of coming up for you and your members, is in my estimation, your commitment to public service. And as I talk with younger people in particular in our business and not in our business, I mean, just as I've got college age kids and we all have, younger folks that we coach. And one of the things I point to are careers that I find, laudable, and yours is one of them. And I point out public service and the role of that. And so talk a little bit about that and sort of what motivated you in that area.
Well, I was very fortunate to have a lot of exposure in different levels. I started out always being a bit of an energy geek, but I never knew I'd actually have a career in it. And working in the Washington State Legislature in Olympia, my home state of Washington, was just a fantastic experience. I covered more than electricity. I also had the portfolio of telecom and water utilities, some nuclear waste issues. And what was helpful to me professionally during that time was to staff the state Senate on telecom issues as that industry went through a profound transition from a very monolithic, vertically integrated industry to one where competition was pushed out somewhat awkwardly, and dealing with that. And then, of course, later on with the proliferation of cell phones, it changed entirely. But that was good training for what was then to occur on the electricity side of things. And so I was fortunate there. And then I worked for a fabulous U.S. senator, which got me to D.C. That was Slade Gorton. He was on the Energy Committee. He was an appropriator. And first day on the job, I met this guy named Rich Glick because he worked for Dale Bumpers, and we had to build a draft together. That's been quite a few years ago, but it does tell you the nature of our relationships in this city, which can go deep and go back quite a ways. But as long as you maintain professional courtesy and friendship, you can get a lot done.
And that is just music to my ears, for one thing. And I hope it's music to the ears of younger people as well, as we talk about how to coach them. And unfortunately, I think it's a characteristic that's in shorter supply than it should be now. But yeah, Rich and I go back to the same place as you do in the Senate, and the House folks are Joe as well, right? I mean, so
Absolutely.
it's a group of pros that goes back a long time, and I think that one of the things that I found interesting talk a little bit about the balance of sort of rural and urban interests that you maybe in the Washington legislature, maybe that folks that are sort of spending their careers here in D.C. don't kind of get a direct feel for,
On a much larger scale, Washington State, being at kind of the upper corner of the country, has, like a lot of the inland West, there's kind of a Western populism, which is based in kind of rural America and co-ops. And so it's a big public power state. We have 3 EEI member companies who operate there, but there are public utility districts, there are municipal utilities there. There are several co-ops. I grew up on co-op lines. And so the mix there was a good one because getting people on the same page on a general or a major policy initiative, such as our massive conservation legislation in 1990, that was very successful. But it took a lot to make sure that everyone with their various interests could be supportive in the end on something that was great public policy, but probably in terms of nationwide, it was the most aggressive energy efficiency approach at the time. And so that's just one example of balancing the needs of some customers who are going to be in more urban areas with the needs of the entities that serve the more rural areas that obviously have similar infrastructure but a lot fewer customers to pay for it.
Right. And I've always been, impressed by the balance with the decisions that you made on the Hill and the decisions that, in advising the senator and the decisions that you made at FERC in terms of balancing national and state policy, which is tough. And that is something that I think I used to listen to Senator Dorgan, who said, well, airline deregulation really didn't help us very much in North Dakota, right? So those issues, I'm sure, are right on the cusp of kind of what you were dealing with in Washington. And talk about a little bit about how you saw those issues as you came here to Washington and how they informed you at FERC.
At the time I came, you may recall, there was a major effort to restructure the industry at the retail level. And there was a lot of talk in the House. There wasn't as much enthusiasm in the Senate. But the reason I really moved here was the belief that Senator Gorton had. And in the end, events changed this perspective. But his feeling was that this was coming, with Washington State having a unique role of, again, investor-owned energy companies, public power, the presence of Bonneville, public preference in the law, regional preference in the law, that he wanted to be at the table when these negotiations were occurring. And so that's why he brought me here. And it was a lot to deal with in terms of how we approached that. And there was an element of regional protectionism not entirely, but to make sure that the benefits of the Northwest Hydro System were not completely eliminated with any major restructuring.
Right, or fanned out beyond the region.
Some of it would be beyond the region anyway.
Right.
But I think what people struggled with, and this is before the West Coast crisis, was the thought that other regions would steal all the cheap power without an understanding that in the Pacific Northwest, it relies on the South in the winter and then sends the surplus power in the summer to the South. So it's already a very regionally connected system, and yet the perception was otherwise.
And so that points up something that a macro level issue in our stuff, so to speak, I've struggled with throughout my career, and that is, on one level, you have that political layer that you just talked about. What is the perception? They're taking our stuff, right? But in reality, both economically and as an operational system, it's not really the case. And I know that I think that what I've really enjoyed about watching you work and stuff that you've done is to explain those things with a pragmatic kind of approach. Talk a little bit about how you bridge that gap with patience, because it's certainly not something I have. So,
hopefully, I bring enthusiasm to my public presentations, and I endeavor to make sure that the audience, if they are not as well seasoned as the three of us, can get some basics. Right. And even at the commission, we worked hard toward the end of my term there to make sure that the younger folks who had arrived at the commission had an understanding of where we had come from with Order 636 and particularly Order 888. The industries were very, very different in 1992 than they are now, or maybe a little farther back if you go with gas. And if you don't have an understanding of that historical perspective of why those changes were proposed and a lot of the benefits that we now take for granted, you're not going to have a full understanding of why you need to tweak policies going forward. So some audiences are well aware of that, but I never want to speak above them, but also don't want to speak below them either. To me, it's just such a fun subject. I like it so much that I enjoy talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things jump to mind. One of the things is sort of cocktail party talk. When there's a political change, people will ask me how's that going to affect your work, or how's that going to affect, if they know a lot about it, how's that going to affect FERC? And I always point out, similar to what you guys were saying, that a lot of these issues don't break down on traditional party lines, and we've all three of us have lived through that. So, I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, just how it's a lot of times it's more regional, or it's rural versus urban, or whatever it is, or it's different sectors of the industry. But then the other point I was going to make too, or ask about, was you were just mentioning the younger folks, if they realize where we came from. One of the things that I always try to remind people is it's not, market-based rates is not the baseline. It's just and reasonable rates. And a cost-supported rate is perfectly fine. So it just as an example of what the statute really says, and just in your time at FERC, if you had some anecdotes where you might have experienced that sort of thing.
Well, thanks, Bill. For the first question, the regional differences probably are less than they used to be, but they really, from our time, defined the politics of energy policy and electricity policy on the Hill. We had much more in common as a region, regardless of our party affiliation, than we did with other regions of the country. And we made sure that we stuck together as much as we could. And in my role, I was kind of like a big brother to a lot of the Northwest delegation, because I'd been doing it longer. I was a little older than some of them. And so in that sense, some of that, with the way the industry has transformed, particularly in the last 10 years, there are less regional differences given the amount of renewable particularly wind and solar generation, that is more ubiquitous now. Of course, the reduced cost of generating this power makes a big difference, and we still need to work on transmission policy to make sure that wherever it's generated, it can get to load. But I see the regional differences, frankly, less visible than they used to be, and the partisan differences are probably a little more extreme than they used to be. Anecdotally, at FERC, we had issues where I considered myself the hydro commissioner because of my background in that part of the country and the prevalence of hydro. And just as an example, unless you kind of are around that all the time, it might not be obvious that a hydro system has more than power. It can be storage for flood control. It can be irrigation. It can be navigation. It's certainly recreation. In the Northwest, it's fish. So you have a river system that has 7 distinct uses
and masters sometimes.
And constituencies.
Yeah, right, yeah. Masters. Mm-hmm.
And that's one small example where perhaps I brought to FERC a little wider perspective on the trade-offs that are involved when you license or relicense a hydropower project.
One of the things that I think is fascinating, though, as you move to batteries, we move to that kind of storage,
right,
which is a different kind of storage. But
it is.
Storage, nonetheless, is some of the issues that were the baseline for 636 and 888. We're facing them a little bit again, right? As an asset now has generation characteristics and transmission characteristics kind of all in one. Where is EEI sitting on those kinds of issues? Does it matter? How do we kind of look at batteries in terms of value? Do we want to look at it more on a localized basis, on a regional basis? I mean, what's your thoughts on that kind of thing?
All of the above.
All of the above.
Yes. I'll first go back to my time at the commission when the storage proposals were really pretty new. And as you mentioned earlier, the costs were higher. And our approach at the time was essentially, if you want to propose your storage project as generation and have it exempt from FERC, and you made the case, okay. If you want it to be a transmission asset, fine. If you want it to be classified as ancillary services, we did it. There were a few of them out there. Some of them were kind of precedent setting. But now I think with the commission going forward with directing the RTOs to make sure that storage assets are treated comparably, that's a great approach. We, as an association, we would have and have weighed in on this. We wanted the state opt-out along with some other entities. But that aside, we're quite pleased with the direction there. And the challenge, and you alluded to it, Cliff, is that this is a new asset that brings more than its traditional counterparts do in terms of TD or ancillary services or generation. It can do more than one. And regulators have struggled with making sure that it's fairly compensated, but not overcompensated. That's something that regulators really stick to. So it's been a bit of a learning experience, I think, for them to figure out where that goes. A lot of that goes under the RTOs in terms of the compliance. I won't get into any individual compliance filings, but hey, it's exciting. And it's something that our member companies have embraced because it's going to help better meet customer needs in terms of the type of energy supply they want, making their systems more flexible. And we're in this strange place where peak is changing throughout the country. Regionally, there are big differences, and there can be overgen in the afternoon. That was unthought of, unimaginable 20 years ago. But that's a pretty profound change, and we have to be adaptive, and storage will help us get there.
Yeah, and I think that's, at least from my perspective, regulators both at state and federal level need to be flexible, because to me this is kind of the ultimate utility infielder. You know what I mean? I mean, this is a guy that can come in and, hit 10 home runs and get on base at 310 or whatever, or, and
Steal some bases.
It's so with a guy like that,
well, let's say
or a player like that.
Make some good plays.
Yeah,
we won't talk about stealing anything.
Okay, right. Well, that's part of the game. That's right. That's part of the game.
I agree. No.
Yeah. But with somebody like that, right, it's difficult to put them in a box.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the things that regulators need to show is flexibility here. That's from my perspective, but I think you've always been a devotee of that as well. So
absolutely. And sometimes there's a reluctance in the regulatory community, and I understand it, to be cautious. There's a tendency to be cautious because if something goes wrong, they'll get the heat. If something goes right, they will rarely be thanked for it. So as this technology becomes more widespread, I think it's incumbent on everybody who has an interest to keep regulators informed as to how it's going and the benefits and the challenges here and there, and where it has potential, and making sure that it's considered in the whole portfolio of energy assets and is treated comparably, but in a way that also doesn't get preferential treatment.
Right. And on that score, I think I got one of the top transmission experts in the country here, so I'm going to pick your brain a little bit on that, which might be a little bit off topic. But the Commission's NOI kind of, without talking about details, it's pretty safe to say it kind of raises a whole bunch of different ways of looking at the asset, ways investors should think about the asset, ways customers and state regulators should think about the asset. Where do you see transmission as fitting in the future in this regard? Are we going to be in a world of doing more with less in terms of CAPEX? Where do you see the RTO planning aspects? Is there a reliance on that, maybe like there used to be or there is now? Where do you see the forward curve for that?
Well, I'm still bullish on transmission and the need for it, and it'll take a lot to convince me otherwise. And yet the challenges are real in terms of getting it built and getting it paid for. I believe the NOI raises a lot of great questions that need to be answered, and clarifying the policy on the ROE with the NOI there is obviously very important, something that we and our member companies have spent a lot of time on. But look, our customers want more clean power. And for the most part, it's much, much less expensive to generate at a universal scale as opposed to a more private rooftop scale. It's less than a third, at least in terms of solar, of generating power universally than individually. And so we have to be cognizant of that, but that, of course, means that you need the transmission to get it there. My sense is that the challenge now is having regulators better understand the various regional planning processes and what goes into them. I think there's perhaps a lack of information or a lack of education on those existing processes and the fact that they're there and they provide in themselves elements of competition. And again, that's an area where I think we can help explain the current system better. You'll always have the challenges with cost allocation, and the commission and the courts will have to deal with that. I go back to the MISO MVP projects, and the last of which was just approved this week in Wisconsin. And
Not without a fight, though.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
Not without a fight.
Yeah.
In that case, between various environmental groups on each side of the issue. But as I think back on the MVP projects, and I've been bringing this up in my public speeches more recently, partly because I was out in Des Moines on the 10th anniversary of that big letter that the governor sent to FERC saying, we've got all this resource, but we need a way to get it to the people who are going to consume it. And that's really what led to the process. But it was controversial at the time. We were getting nasty letters from governors and industrial users saying, how dare you do this? And I would think, let's put the last one aside, almost everyone agrees that the MVP projects have been a huge success. They've allowed for cheaper power to go to customers. Congestion's been reduced. Reliability has been enhanced. But at the time, it was a tough sell. And now they're fully subscribed. Right. And so if you talk to those folks, they need another tranche of them. And what I warn people is it's probably even harder to build it now. So you better get ready. You better make your case really well. Because, again, customers want that power that needs transmission to get it to them.
Yeah, it's a challenging time to build transmission, but as you said, we all lived through the MVP portfolio from conception to being built out. But in an era where load growth is generally flat, but at the same time, you have this tremendous desire, I think, among customers to see the greening of the generation fleet, which then leads to a need to, most times, bring power in from remote sites to load. It's a harder story to tell, I think, but it's a story worth telling on behalf of our clients. But I guess I was going to ask, we talk about the states and the federal. With respect to storage, it seems like a lot of the actions happening at the state level,
right?
New York, California, other states have aggressive goals in terms of storage mandates. But at the same time, you do have FERC with Order 841 and trying to encourage participation at the wholesale level. Where do you see the action being, so to speak, over the next 5 years? Do you think it's still going to be driven a lot by the states, or with 841 sort of maturing, there might be more pure play wholesale plays, so to speak?
Yeah, I think, again, based on cost, the wholesale play is probably going to be more prominent. But we have states, as you mentioned, Bill, that are aggressively pushing storage, trying to get through the rules, whether it's interconnection or compensation. In our case, we feel our member companies need to be able to own it. And that goes back to definitions. If it's defined as generation and our companies are in states where they can't own generation, that's not only going to inhibit the development of storage, it'll inhibit the development of microgrids because they'll be an essential part of it. I go back to switching gears a little bit, the electric vehicle charging issue. And in that sense, Bill, I think we've got, and Cliff, we've got...
It's the same thing. It's just load instead of gen. It's the same sort of concept.
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
And that's where actually we could see load growth.
Right.
It's going to be gradual, but potentially very significant, and as well as the electrification movements generally. But in California, in 2011, they decided that our member companies couldn't own EV charging stations. And then remarkably, they reversed themselves 3 years later.
Right.
And they realized that they weren't going to get the job done without them. I think it's a good analogous example to storage, that if you really want to maximize its potential to benefit customers and benefit system stability, all comers should be welcome. And so that's a bedrock principle for us. And in some cases, that means changing the law or making sure that the definitions are such that, again, our companies can own it.
So let me leave you with a quick sort of comment and then an opportunity for you to kind of sum up. And we kind of like around here, it's kind of old, but the SWOT analysis of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It's a little old at this point, but I think it's a good way to sum things up. But one of the things I'm struck by when I go to conferences now is younger people talking about the concept of environmental justice and just what is it, right? And what does it mean? But one of the things I kind of point out is, well, if you're going to be making some assumptions about market power and what customers can and can't do in this environment, you have to understand that EEI companies are really, for the most part, on the hook, or suppliers of last resort, whatever, whether they're investor owned or not, are on the hook to supply folks who just don't have those options, right? They don't have the rooftop solar option. They don't have the self-gen option. They don't have the battery option. They don't have the EV option. So one of the things that I point out to folks is, well, when you're talking about environmental justice, you have to look at the people who actually pay rates, right? Can they afford it? And that's another kind of environmental justice to think about. But I'll leave you with that as you kind of, close us out. And again, thank you very, very much for your time, because this has been fantastic.
Well, I've enjoyed it greatly, and thank you for the interest and also all the questions, particularly this last one as well. I think the first premise is electricity is truly a bargain. And it is the lowest percentage of household income since they started keeping statistics in the 50s. That said, we have to maintain an effort to assure that it is safe, reliable, and affordable. And the newer renewable technologies have helped with their price, the decrease in the cost of production of that power. But we also need the grid to be there, because that's what enables everything to happen now and the stuff that we haven't even imagined in the future that, again, can better help customers manage their energy and consume their energy in ways that they want and make sense economically. So it's always a trade-off. And I always keep reminding folks, particularly younger folks, that this is really the last industry that has an obligation to serve. Used to be others, but with changes in those industries, that's really changed. And that's a defining principle that is unique and requires attentiveness by everyone, particularly regulators, to manage the fact that affordability is important, but also making sure, now that we have this incredible technological leap forward, that we have flexible regulation that allows customers to better take advantage of some of these opportunities, which are really exciting and empowering. And generationally, it's going to be different. For people who are raising kids and have a family, they probably don't have a lot of time to think about it. But if you're older and retired, you might be able to, it might be a nice hobby to be managing your energy. And if you're a millennial or a Generation Z, it's probably in your blood to kind of do this. So
it's all about the customer's marginal utility is kind of what that economic concept. What benefit are you getting out of the lower price or the optionality? If you're not getting any benefit, it's not for you. Then we have to provide other kinds of services for those folks. Otherwise, we're not meeting their needs. Right?
That's exactly right. And the system is remarkably reliable when you really break it down. And the value of electricity is so much higher when you don't have it than what you pay for it. But again, that goes back to the need to make sure that the grid, whether it's at the distribution level or the bulk power system level, is maintained and enhanced in ways that assure that reliability going forward.
Thank you so much, Phil. This has been fantastic. Absolutely. And we'd love to have you back if you're willing to spend the time. I know time gets crunched, but anytime you want to come back, you're welcome to.
I'll come back to this opulent studio anytime. Thank you all for having me.
Thank you, Phil.
Absolutely. Thank you.
These recorded materials are designed for educational purposes only. This podcast is not legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants. Troutman Sanders does not make any representations or warranties, express or implied, regarding the contents of this podcast. Information on previous case results does not guarantee a similar future result. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal and other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission of Troutman Sanders.